Hello, everyone. It's really good to have you back with us. We're in a sort of back to school mood, the 1st of September 2025. So thank you for coming back. If you're coming back, I can see some familiar faces in the participants list. And thank you for joining us if you're here for the first time. What we do, as a reminder, is chat about one particular play, um, drawing on the Oxford World's Classics edition. And today we're going to be talking about Comedy of Errors, and I'll introduce Ian Burrows, who's done that great introduction in a minute. We will be talking for about perhaps 45 or 50 minutes or something. Do post questions using the Q&A function, which is at the bottom of your screen. Post those as we go if you think of questions, because sometimes if you're feverishly typing during the question period at the end, we don't always get time to get to the question, but we'll try and get to as many as we can. So if you've got something in your mind, put it in as we go along. I should have introduced myself first. My name's Emma Smith. I'm the general editor of the Oxford World Classics Shakespeare edition, which draws on the work of the new Oxford Shakespeare. That's an amazing scholarly project, edited by Gary Taylor, John Jowett, Terry Boris, and Gabriel Egan. And in particular, their associate editor, Sarah Neville, was the person who did the textual work on the Comedy of Errors, which both Ian and I have been depending on for the work we have done. My job as general editor has been to get people to write readable, up-to-date introductions to Shakespeare plays, bringing out what we might want to think about them in the 2020s. And it's been such a treat for me actually to handpick the people I've wanted to work with on it. And Ian Burrows from the University of Cambridge was always on my list. I read a book of his with a brilliant title, but it's a very smart book. The book is called Shakespeare for Snowflakes. And Ian does lots of things in that short book, but one of the things he does in particular is to think about why content and trigger warnings around Shakespeare have sort of become such a sort of cultural flashpoint, I suppose. And in that, it seems a more and more prescient book as wokeness has become a way of attacking a lot of the work that we do, but strangely, a lot around Shakespeare. So that's a long introduction, but Ian, thank you so much for writing your introduction to Comedy of Errors and for being willing to chat about the play this evening.
Thank you for having me, and hello, everyone.
Brilliant. We're going to start. So one of the things we have learned from these webinars is that there's a fabulous range of people here. Sometimes people who don't really know anything about the play at all, people who are very expert, and lots of people in between. So we sort of start maybe without much. We start by giving as much information as we can, but we can move quite quickly. This is a smart audience, as we've come to realize, so we'll take people with us. So I'm just going to ask you first then about this play. What? Just tell us what it's about. Where does it come in Shakespeare's working life? What's it doing?
It's interesting that it's often being considered, I think, one of Shakespeare's earlier plays. It's not super early. The first recorded performance we have for it is 1594. It may have been written earlier than that, but it has been for a long time thought of as maybe a bit thin, a bit of a knockabout comedy. That it's driven mostly by plot, not by character. So I'm trying to caveat that by saying it's been thought of like that, because I don't necessarily agree with all of that. The plot of it concerns, I'm going to get really confused trying to explain it. It begins essentially with somebody trying to find his lost twin. They were separated at sea 25 years previous. He's traveled from Syracuse to Ephesus when they were separate, where his twin has ended up, he believes. And he is going to search for his twin. He's joined by his servant, possibly slave, possibly bondsman, who's also looking for his lost twin as well. So you have,
What are the
and
chances, eh? What are the
exactly,
chances?
you have Antipholus of Syracuse, Dromio of Syracuse, both arrived in Ephesus looking for their lost twins. And the lost twins happen to have the same names as them. So Antipholus of Syracuse is looking for Antipholus of Ephesus, Dromio of Syracuse is looking for Dromio of Ephesus. And as they wander around Ephesus looking for them, there's basically a procession of encounters which are founded upon confusion, mistaken identity. The Dromios getting mixed up for each other, the Antipholuses getting mixed up for each other. And then at the end, everything is straightened out and we have a kind of lovely reunion scene along the way. So I've tried to explain that
Hmm.
as concisely as possible, but it can get very confusing.
Hmm. Brilliant. So there's a two twin play. There's a couple of things I know I want to pick up as the conversation develops. That question about sort of traveling and the relation of the servant slaves. It was great that you brought up both of those. That's so interesting. But let's just have one more thing about the plot. So I was rereading your introduction and reminding myself what a lot you get out of the opening scene. So the plot, as you've just described it, has often seemed to be quite knockabout, quite slapstick. One character runs off, the doppelganger runs in somehow. It's got a lot of speed, it's got a lot of energy, and the mistaken identity and so on is funny and keeps things moving. But that both tonally and sort of rhythmically, that's not how the play starts. Can you just remind us a bit about that opening scene?
Mhm, mhm. So yes, that opening scene is actually very important, and I think it's one that until I came back to write the introduction, I've tended to dismiss, see as something quite functional. So the father of the Antipholuses has turned up in Ephesus and is condemned to death because he shouldn't be there. And what he provides is an extraordinarily long exposition in some ways of what's happened, how he's ended up there, how his children have been lost at sea, how he's looking for them, and how he's looking for his wife as well, who was also lost at sea. Um, so in the introduction, uh, actually looking at that scene, it has a real attention to uh, not just kind of providing exposition in a functional way, but actually in quite a self-conscious way, the kind of hopelessness of it. Uh, Kent Cartwright, who edited the play for Arden, kind of points out that Aegean says, as he kind of sums up why he's telling the story at such length, he says, "Hopeless and helpless doth Aegean wend, but to procrastinate his end." And Kent Cartwright points out, procrastinate is a word that Shakespeare doesn't use anywhere else in his career. And so there's something really interesting about the self-consciousness of that scene where this quite hopeless figure in a way is kind of saying, look, I'm just telling you this whole story about how I'm looking for my lost ones, my lost loved ones. Um, but he's kind of aware in some ways that he's just padding things out or taking up time in the way that he does it. And then of course the other parent who comes in the reunion is the Antipholus' mother, Amelia. Um, uh, and yeah, I think it is very important that were we to just see the Antipholus brothers, the Dromio brothers, pursuing each other, being kind of interchangeable, then that would be a very different play from something that's bookended with this attention to origins, parenthood, family. There's something actually quite kind of weighty there. But both Amelia and Aegean are sort of shoved off the stage for most of the play, and they only sort of come in at either end.
Yes, I really was really struck by what you say about that in the introduction. I mean, both about the length of Aegean's explanation of this shipwreck, how it was that they all got separated. Uh, I mean, it's sort of I don't know, it seems a bit knife and forkish to say. I mean, is it kind of 10 minutes? I mean, it's a big long piece of talking, isn't it? But you also, so I was thinking about the sort of physical or rhythmic effect of that in the play. But you also bring out that the content of what's happened, this is this incredible trauma of tying yourself to a spar on a ship, with an infant to try to survive and being split from other family members. Um, how did you feel? I mean, trauma isn't something that we necessarily associate with comedy, and we certainly don't tend to associate it with this play, which, as you point out, has tended to be dismissed a bit as not having very much serious um, to say for itself. How do you
Mm,
feel that how useful is that term to bring in?
mm. It's something I wondered about when writing about it, because the content what's being described is clearly an event that would have traumatic response, I think, or kind of traumatic consequence for the people involved. Um, and the other thing that I was sort of turning over when I was kind of looking at that scene was thinking, well, am I just being too cynical? Am I being too 21st century about this scene? And thinking, well, this is too talky. I would have skipped to the next episode on Netflix by now. Like this is skip intro. Um, and that would an early modern audience be actually much more conditioned to be following what has the potential to be a kind of really imperious sort of monologue that's kind of interrupted at points, mostly interrupted to say, "Go on, please." Um, and the points at which Aegean falters and kind of says, I can't say anymore," might be very, very affecting as a result. So that was one thing that I kind of wondered, is that it might be that I'm not sort of looking at this scene from the right point of view if I just kind of think it's too long or it's self-conscious or ironic in these moments. Um, but then I also think there's something. I think possibly there is something that does kind of speak to traumatic experience not being so much talked about from that point in the play, but that gets sort of buried in the characters and comes out in their behaviors. So I suppose what I mean by that is we have a very full account, almost quite a diligent, hyper attention to detail account of the shipwreck and the ship coming apart and how everyone tied themselves to masts as is best practice in a storm and so on. Um, and then in the play, you just get watery images crop up again, oceans crop up again, and not explicitly tied to those memories. But there's something kind of very interesting about the fact that the kind of imagery that sort of keeps kind of rising to the surface almost without the awareness or kind of explicit um, reference of the characters. It's just sort of there, and we are the ones who pick up on it. I think that is very interesting, and then I think the other thing that makes me find the play in a way quite affecting and more affecting, because there aren't that many instances where characters talk about how traumatized they are. It doesn't come out in how they talk. It comes about in their progressive loss of agency, their attempted efforts to kind of try and get that agency back. And so I think Aegean sort of holds the space and sort of gives us that picture verbally of the traumatic circumstance. And then it's sort of up to us to see characters not talking about being out of control necessarily, but being out of control, swimming about, not being able to find themselves in the play that follows. So actually, in a way, I kind of think the trauma comes out through the comic behaviors
Mm.
more than than it would through a kind of tragic disquisition or a set of tragic monologues, if that makes sense.
And that's so interesting to think of this as a play where Shakespeare starts to engage with loss, familial loss, and that's going to be the thing that motors, that's the engine of lots of tragedies, I suppose. It's more in the background, I suppose, of later comedies like Twelfth Night or something, play I've been thinking about a lot, that emerges from so much from mourning and grief and so on, and then takes us through maybe to late plays and those, what are the touch points you feel this play has with later plays by Shakespeare?
I mean, thinking of just of that Aegean scene, um, the the strange place I think that my mind went when I was looking at it was uh, places like Macbeth. So I wrote about this in the introduction because as he was talking about hopeless and helpless doth the Aegean wend, um, this attention to just kind of walking without purpose or moving without purpose made me think of Macbeth's sort of very famous life's but a walking shadow, a player that struts and frets his hour upon a stage. That some of the talk in Comedy of Errors, um, even at that early stage, is kind of interested in that sort of redundant movement of just kind of milling around. And that actually comes up in Act 1, Scene 2, when Antipholus of Syracuse, quite surprisingly, just kind of says, I'm just going to walk up and down and have a look around for a while before we go and meet at the inn. I'm a bit stiff from the journey. I'm just going to go and see the sights. So the play is a bit like that one monologue in Macbeth, quite interested in that redundant movement. And then obviously in Macbeth and in that kind of tragic scenario, that kind of redundant movement becomes hopeless, becomes kind of empty and devoid of meaning. Um, and the other place that I go to a lot is I feel like I can't read Hamlet now without thinking of the Comedy of Errors, because there are so many doubles all the way through it, uh, that early on Hamlet is sort of arranged opposite his father, also called Hamlet. Uh,
Mm,
Hamlet is one of several sons who have lost fathers,
mm,
Fortinbras, Laertes, um, that or Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, that actually Shakespeare and Hamlet, which again is a play about that sort of problem of finding one's identity or kind of
mm,
fixing one's identity, and it's just a plethora of these doubles all
mm.
over the place. Uh, so in some
Isn't
sense,
there something uncanny about that, isn't there? The scene in this play, the scene in Comedy of Errors that I always think about is the scene where the visiting Antipholus, the one who doesn't belong, gets pulled in to the house or mistaken for his brother, and um, the brother's wife, makes much of him and says, come, here you are, and eat, here's your dinner, and and he's just sort of thinking, well, I don't know, but okay. And then outside the door comes the master of the house, the brother who lives there. And he knocks on the door and they say, well, you can't come in. And he says, well, what do you mean I can't come in? This is my house. And they say, because you're already here. You're already in eating your dinner. And there's a way in which that's, funny and absurd. There's a way in which there's times when I just find that utterly terrifying, as a model of alienated sort of personhood that, of course, it all is explained because there are two of them, and um, this has an explanation in the real world, but it seems to open a door to a kind of terror about what it is to be a person, which is about, I don't know, being in one place at one time or being recognized by other people to be the person that you think you are. And one of the seriously funny things that Comedy of Errors does is to sort of, I don't know, pull all that into question a bit in a way that we associate more with a play like Hamlet, which is talking about doing that a lot rather than doing it quite so situationally.
Mhm. Um, and thinking what then happens to Antipholus of Ephesus, a line that I think is kind of extraordinary. So in some ways, with Comedy of Errors, I think so much of what is interesting is the way Shakespeare moves everyone around the stage, and where we tend to think of Shakespeare the Bard kind of writing this kind of wonderful verse, that in a sense, I think the Comedy of Errors is most interesting as Shakespeare the dramatist. How is he using the mechanics of the stage and of the figures on stage to generate that kind of anxiety or uncanniness, and comedy. But then every now and then there are just these outbreaks of kind of phenomenally interesting verse, or just individual, like particular lines where you just think that's so much more interesting than it has any right to be. And Antipholus of Ephesus is taken away because he's considered insane, and a bit like Malvolio is kind of treated for his madness. And the line that I always find extraordinary is when Antipholus of Ephesus eventually kind of gnaws through his bonds and escapes. He talks about how Dr. Pinch, the mountebank who's treating him, looks into his face, and he describes him as a living dead man, and says, with no face as 'twere outfacing me. And there's just, again, I think a bit like you're saying, that what's being confronted there is not, oh, there's someone who looks like me, that's very unsettling, but actually I have no face. I'm looking into a mirror and I am seeing nothing. And so, yeah, Shakespeare does have those moments. There it's kind of put verbally, but yeah, I agree, that moment at the door is kind of, in practice, what does it mean to suddenly be told you are nobody? Yeah.
And you're right that the sort of the consequence of this being madness, or in some ways the very definition of madness, to sort of not know who you are, or um, to deny that certain things have happened to you which other people feel they can witness. They saw you do, and the way that madness emerges as the illogical conclusion of that is really striking. Again, I hadn't thought so much about the echoes in Hamlet that pick up some of this work. Yeah. Let's move to think about the servants. Why did you qualify what the Dromios sort of social or legal position might be? You said they may be servants or slaves or bondsmen. Unpack that a bit for us, and why does that matter, do you think?
Uh, it's partly because the source text, one of the source texts that Shakespeare comes to for the Comedy of Errors, which is Plautus's Menachmi, is set in Rome and is much more relaxed, I suppose, about the fact that we're talking about the relationship between a master and a slave. And I suppose the reason and I forget the title, but Morris Hunt has a fantastic article about this. I suppose just pointing out that in some ways Shakespeare dilutes that language, but it's not very clarified what the exact relationship is between the Dromios and the Antipholuses. In Aegean's exposition, the Dromios are referred to as being born to a woman of meaner sort, and he refers to buying them, I think. But then again, as with a lot of very troubling things in the Comedy of Errors, it's sort of just allowed to submerge, and so what then sort of seems to be patterned out is something much closer to a kind of early modern relationship of service. But it's not made as explicit as it could be. And then I think that again sort of puts the knockabout slapstick attacks, normally one of the Antipholuses upon one of the Dromios, puts it in quite a precarious position where, rather than a sort of a kind of Laurel and Hardy relationship of that, there's one dominant member of the duo and one more subordinate, that actually when it becomes more entrenched, and our attention is maybe just invited to think about this. This is something kind of built upon social inequality. That this isn't just a kind of duo playing out oppression, but actually it's something that's kind of running all the way through the society that they're part of. Again, Shakespeare could, I feel, clarify that or make it a bit safer if he wanted.
Yeah, God, that's really fascinating, because it's making me think that one of the ways the confusion for the Antipholus is, particularly for Antipholus of Syracuse, the one who's visiting, is that people keep giving him things, don't they? It's as if he has this fantasy life which he floats through. He's given a gold chain. He doesn't seem to have to pay for it. He's given this dinner and this apparent wife, and he sort of goes along with it. So for him, it seems mistaken identity brings with it these uncanny but sort of nevertheless rather generous benefits. Whereas the Dromios, the confusion for the Dromios just is to get beaten, isn't it? They've brought the wrong thing. The master thinks they've been told to bring such and such, but that was the different one. And so what's a constant in that is they get beaten. So more and more for them, confusion reinscribes their subservient status, and more for the Antipholuses, it sort of inscribes them as senior consumers in the city, isn't it? That they are, buying and participating in the sort of consumer culture of the city.
There's, I mean, one of the things that I'm not, I'd be really interested to know where you stand on this. But when I look at the Comedy of Errors, I don't know how conservative I think Shakespeare is socially. I don't know how alarmed he is by the kind of the threat of anarchy in these relationships and in the society that he's showing. The one of the pieces that I referred to a few times in the introduction was by Nandini Das, The Stranger at the Door, and she points out, I think, really interestingly, that the Comedy of Errors is written at a time where there's suddenly a spike in xenophobia and fear of strangers in London in Shakespeare's time.
How quaintly historic.
Exactly. It's very hard to kind of take ourselves back to that period.
I know, goodness me.
But one of the things that Das kind of explores is how Shakespeare doesn't just kind of play into that discourse of fear of strangers, i.e., fear of a foreigner coming in here, taking your place in your house, being in bed with your wife, shutting the door against you. But actually, the play is very interested in what it would mean to feel like a stranger, and to not have bonds, to exist sort of without social bonds, economic bonds. And
that's really interesting. And that's very short-lived then, isn't it? If that's a kind of liberation almost, or a different kind of personhood, it's quite short, given the way the play itself is going to reattach everybody. That's such a really interesting thought. Sorry, I interrupted you just to be enthusiastic about what you were saying. So keep going.
but that's, I suppose, one of the things that I just don't know where Shakespeare is or wants me to be with this play. That as often with Shakespeare plays, it feels like he's too complicated to say, here he is just being starkly xenophobic, performing xenophobic play to a xenophobic audience that were quite inclined to want Shakespeare to make it more complicated than that. But it is a play, I think, that's anxious about what happens if people are kind of, if bonds are dissolved, and where I would anticipate something a lot more kind of carnivalesque, or for a longer period. But it is there, as you say, for Antipholus of Syracuse.
Mm.
But the play, it seems, is very worried about the fact that people are quite quickly without place, without position, that marriages now are interchangeable, that objects can belong to anyone interchangeably, that there's something troubling in the anarchy there rather than something that's very liberating, I think. But I don't know if
That's interesting. So does that suggest that the play sees these relationships from a social or communitarian kind of point of view rather than a kind of individualistic one? So I'm just sort of thinking as I speak, but sort of suggesting that it is more the person who doesn't conform. I'm thinking about all that work. Sorry, I'm going to restart. I'm thinking about that all that work about early modern London, which says, why didn't London have a great riot, despite this anti-immigration stuff that Nandini Das and others have written about so brilliantly and so um, urgently. It didn't have a major riot or rebellion or uprising. Didn't have and I think the answer historians give is that people were part of all these intersecting or connected Russian doll kinds of connections, the parish, the guild, so that they were all that forms of interconnectedness were a very strong form of bonding. And that's what keeps the peace or keeps everybody in their place. And I've just yeah, so it's that context which is making me think that the Antipholus who comes in to the play is a sort of masterless man, isn't he? In that great sort of bogey phrase of the Elizabethan period, the man who has no master. How frightening is that he could do anything he wants? And yeah, that's a really interesting take. So does that suggest that the ending of the play is conservative, is folding all that anarchy back up into the family as the place of restraint or something?
yeah, I wonder. It's I mean, I do worry that I'm spending a lot of time with this play, kind of coming to every scene and saying, God, isn't this awkward and troubling when, much of the play isn't, it's a delight. It's, and the,
Mm.
um, um, and for the introduction, I sort of looked in particular at two productions where, um, I would say the audience response to those productions at the end was very different. So the 2023 Globe production, which was directed by Sean Holmes, certainly the night that I was there, it felt like it petered out, which is no reflection on the production. The production was very good, but the audience, I think, were very much in a place of thinking, oh well, there's a lot here that you've had to cobble together. That
Mm.
when I spoke to Sean Holmes about the production, the line that he kept coming back to in that scene was, um, "It must be Antipholus of Ephesus." Just says, "I never knew my father in all my life," and that really does prevent the idea that, oh, Daddy, hooray!
Yeah.
You can't really gloss over that, and that production didn't. Um, the other production that I looked at was directed by Corinne Jaber, and it was put on at the Globe in 2012 as part of the Globe to Globe Festival, and she directed an Afghan theatre troupe called Roy Sabs, and the production there ended, and it was interesting speaking to Corinne Jaber. I think she really tried to not have the production collapse into a joyful reunion. She wanted it more poised and reserved and held back. But the actors ended up incredibly sort of extroverted, and I think the sort of lent into that delight to find their family members again. And the audience as well whooped, hollered, standing ovation, absolutely delighted.
Mm,
The accounts of that seem to have been slightly conditioned by the circumstances of the performers, that this being in itself an achievement, that this
mm,
Afghan theatre company were here performing the Comedy of Errors. Um, uh, they had to change rehearsal premises because the British Council offices where they'd been rehearsing had been bombed. There's such a lot kind of feeding into that
mm,
feeling that not just the play, but this production had reached a culmination. Um, Sonia, that's an incredibly long answer, and it's not really an answer to where I think the play ends with that kind of sealing things back up
mm.
in bonds. I suppose that non-answer is saying you can do either. It could go
You
either
can
way.
you can do either. So related to that was one thing I wanted to ask you about this play as a comedy. So I often hear myself saying, "Oh, one of the great things about Shakespeare's comedies is roles for women. Comedy is a genre for Shakespeare where women can be witty, they can be desiring, they can shape the narrative, and they usually get what they want." Um, is that is that true of this play? Because as we've been talking about it, even those sort of amazingly interesting and suggestive links with Hamlet suggest this is about masculinity, troubled masculinity. The boy who's never known his father, um, uh, the master and the servant, and all of those things. They all feel like models of um, a particular kind of male identity in forms of self-recognition or crisis or something. What do you think about the role? Is it even a question to ask about this play, do you think, the role of women?
Mm. Um, hmm. I mean, I have in my head those productions now, having kind of brought them up.
Mm,
Um, and the I mean, there's a possibility there, I suppose, in these plays that you put Adriana and Luciana, you just kind of put them in the list of objects or bonds that make up the men, that they
yeah.
become coordinates of the self that then can get switched to another self. And um, one account, I suppose, of the Comedy of Errors is that as we measure that kind of comedy but growing horror of losing one's identity, you lose all these objects, and then oh my god, you've lost your wife. That's the most prized object of all. Um, that's I suppose one take of the on the on the play and the female roles within it. I think that's definitely. I mean, it's definitely the case. I think, um, but I think also seeing it in production, I think I think there's potential in the play for the actors playing those female roles to have some fun in the space that is made to redraw boundaries. Or that there's the I think in those two productions that I mentioned, I became much more aware that um, that you are seeing a figure trying to work out the new status quo just as
Mm,
much as the Antiphases are,
mm,
or
mm,
the Dromios, and even potentially kind of enjoying
mm,
that. So when Luciana is kind of having what she believes is an inappropriate Antipholus coming on to her, there are productions, there are production choices. She can be
mm,
kind of enjoying it, or she can
mm,
just be straightforwardly horror struck that this is wrong, that she is the wrong woman for this man. Um, uh, and again, I think that sort of certainly came to the fore in looking at the Roy Sabbs production, where the the female actors in that play sort of talked openly about how the production, but also the play, sort of energized them or empowered them as women to be reconfiguring or potentially reconfiguring where they want to be, or who they want to be attached to. So it's I mean, the structures of the play don't allow much room
Mm.
for the female characters or the actors playing female characters to do much with that, or to kind of to weigh up alternatives, or kind of imagine agency. But it is, I think there is some room there, which maybe in other Shakespeare plays there isn't quite so much sometimes for female.
Yes, that's interesting that there are two women who talk as equals, for one thing, don't they, rather than in some sort of hierarchical way, the sisters. Um,
Mm,
I was just thinking about the most recent. I think I saw the Sean Holmes one that you've just been talking about, but before that, I'd seen the Royal Shakespeare Company. Philip Breen for the Royal Shakespeare Company did a sort of COVID postponed one. I think it was outdoors in order because the theatre was still, um, social distancing and all those things, and so it was inclined to be very joyful and very sort of community-ish. But the one thing I remember about it was the women, the scene when they talk together about husbands in general, men and Antipholus in particular. They were doing yoga. They were in sort of down dog, and just something about their physical, um, how physically adept they were. Taking up space on the stage in a slightly different way. I think that all these were all ways to add to those roles and to make them resonate outwards, take up a bit more space. But it is
mm,
striking that um, there's a hint, perhaps, of the romantic ending, but not really. I mean, this is a comedy about a married couple who are not happy, where the husband is giving gifts to a courtesan and the wife feels very overlooked, and that
mm,
isn't necessarily resolved, I suppose, at the end
mm,
of the play.
mm, mm. Um, and to come back to something that you sort of reminded me of earlier, um, the the sort of book ending with Aegean and then Amelia as well, sort of
Mm,
slightly um, rebalances the play, so that in a way it's perhaps a lot more like the later romances, and that it's kind of interested in reunion with
mm,
parents, rather than sort of let's get the couples kind of married off
yeah.
in that respect. So the play is sort of very concerned with those social bonds, marriages, and so on. But then it does suddenly sort of take a
Mm,
diversion towards, let's think about where these kids came from,
mm,
for some reason.
mm. Really, really interesting. We're going to do two things before we open up to some of the questions. So if you've got questions, do put them in, um, and we can try and draw those together for the last part of the conversation. I always ask um, I always want to try and anchor the conversation we have in these webinars just for a few minutes on something really quite specific. And so I'm just going to share my screen. Because I asked Ian what he would like to look at, and we agreed on, um, we agreed on this, but can I actually find where it is? Documents. Uh, no, why can't I see that? Okay. Um, Let me just have another go at doing that. Share screens. There we are. Share. Okay, so I hope you can just see this one slide, which was the speech that we wanted to talk about right from the beginning of the play. And no, it partly I think we've partly touched on it, but I wonder if I could get you, Ian, to just talk us through this moment and this how this imagery picks up the points you were making before about the sea and about wandering and
Mhm. It's so it's I. when I emailed you the suggestion, there was an editor who referred to that little, I suppose, monologue of Antipholus of Syracuse, which begins, "He that commends me to mine own content commends me to the thing I cannot get. I to the world am like a drop of water that in the ocean seeks another drop, who falling there to find his fellow forth, unseen, inquisitive, confounds himself." Um, Standish Henning referred to it as the most frequently noticed speech in the play, and I um, I noticed it as well, I suppose. But I think it's noticeable because it's extraordinarily beautiful. I think it's also sort of in keeping with the Shakespeare that we tend to think we know. That he likes monologues like this, where someone is kind of thinking about how they are feeling. He very much likes people kind of saying that they are in some way dissolving. Um, and so Hamlet, "Oh, that this too solid flesh would melt," or Richard, "Oh, the tire and mockery king of snow," in front of this great son of Bolingbroke in Richard II. He comes back often to people sort of being in a funk and kind of saying, "Oh, I sort of feel like I'm melting in some way." Um, so I think it's very interesting for that because slap bang in the middle of a play that is quite often dismissed as rookie Shakespeare, you've got this speech that could be spoken by Hamlet, I think. Uh, so I think that speech is very interesting in itself. And then the reason I sort of wanted to kind of have the lines leading up to it is because I also think that the way in which the merchant is there and then takes his leave is also sort of really just very well important, I think, as well, that there's a kind of as I said earlier, that this Shakespeare kind of setting up this idea of purposelessness, that you have very stock lines like "I will go lose myself," line 30, um, which could be very sort of figurative, conceptual, but then also sort of very concrete and pointless, and "wander up and down to view the city." Um, and the first merchant before that as well sort of has this quite concrete attention to detail. "Soon at 5 o'clock, please you, I'll meet with you upon the mart, and afterward consort you till bedtime." That's a really quaint idea
Mm.
of the kind of timescape of the play as well. So I the whole chunk. I mean, the Antipholus' speech I find really interesting for what it is saying about how he feels. But then I think the way it's framed is also really interesting for the conditions sort of around that speech as well.
That's such a good point. Just as a general way of approaching, in some ways, or big speeches, is to think how are they actually set up or framed. I think that's just such a brilliant insight into what we should be trying to do when we think about um, big lines or speeches that have drawn attention, that plucks them out of their context, and to see, how they emerge in the back and forth of the play. That just seems a really brilliant insight. Yeah, I think this is I think this is an amazing speech, and one of the things I really enjoy about it is it seems to um, recharge some of these words in quite an odd way. So the three lines from the bottom of the screen that we're looking at: unseen, inquisitive. That makes it sound as if it is not quisitive,
Mm.
because it sort of follows unseen. So as if it's a kind of negation. Whereas you think of inquisitive as being an active, I'm trying to find out something, I'm interested to know something.
Mm.
Um, but that it feels as if it sort of, I haven't looked up the etymology of it, but it feels as if it sort of generates itself as a kind of negation rather than because of that. I mean, it's like it's like the bit that you picked out about Dr. Pinch about facing. These are not necessarily difficult words or absolutely complicated constructions, but they're odd words often, and they're oddly a bit more than is needed in the moment. Um,
That's, I mean, the yes, I'd not thought of that at all. It's I think other editors have found that unseen inquisitive weirdly difficult to gloss. That sometimes they've kind of thought maybe it's meant to be sort of unseen inquisitive with unseen sort of as an adverb to the
Mhm.
inquisitive, almost, so that it's unprecedentedly inquisitive or something. But
Mhm.
there's but actually I think that that turning in on himself, the unseen inquisitive confounds himself, that the unseen somehow makes sense here, I think. Who falling there to
Mm.
find his fellow forth unseen, inquisitive, compounds himself is very important, I think.
Mm.
And related to that sort of suggestion that inquisitive might have that ghost of being not quisitive, there is something I think quite inert in the formulations of these sentences. Um, He that commends me to mine own content, commends me to the thing I cannot get. I to the world am like a drop of water. And I don't know how I would rearrange that syntax to be less weird, I suppose, or to be more subject verb object, I suppose,
Mm.
to this idea I to the world am like.
Mm.
That there's a kind of I relate. I'm sort of I have a dative relation to all these different things, or
Yes, that's really interesting, and that makes me think about those last two lines as well. So I mean, that's really so I lose myself, but
yes.
that is itself lost by this big interruption,
Mm.
syntactic interruption, in the way the phrases are put together.
Yeah, and it's just it's remarkably uh remarkably contorted to avoid saying he's going to do anything. So I to find a mother and a brother, not saying so I am going to find a mother and a brother.
Mhm.
It's all sort of subjunctive, or
Mhm.
it's really sort of almost compulsively passive, in the way it's formulated.
Hmm. Yes, I've just noticed Hadia's note on that in the questions. Thanks for that, Hadia. What if unseen and inquisitive being paired together, in spite of the paradoxical approach they create, was intentional in order to confound? So that would be an interesting way of thinking. The the sentence does its own, does its own work of confusion or confounding, which would fit it with lots of the things that Ian points out about comedy of errors, particularly the fact that the first folio text, the first printed edition in 1623, is very low on the kinds of reassuring markers of who's saying what and which twin they are, that have become so standard for modern editors.
It's
That's
actually
great. I'm going to stop that share. Um, and I'm going to move us for the last 15 or so minutes to think through some of the questions that we have got. Daniel Lloyd, I'm just going to stick with you right now. So Antipholus of Syracuse, like his father, is feeling like a procrastinator, not keen on doing. That's such a great thought. So that procrastinate, um, the word that Ian picked out from Aegean's speech, reminding us don't get it anywhere else in Shakespeare. That's such a great, lovely thought. Thank you very much indeed for that. Okay, I'm going to go up to the top of the questions. Um, Jean asks, how were twins made in early productions not to be confused with each other? Um, and I'll put that with, excuse me, another question we've got a bit further down. Do you think an early modern audience would have picked up on the more serious aspects of the play, e.g., surrounding identity? Or do you think they would have seen it as solely entertainment? I suppose they're both about early modern productions and what we feel we know about them. What do you think about the Jean's question about what the twins would look like?
Mm. I mean, one of the reasons I suppose why I have been inclined to see um, the comedy of errors, despite its kind of very like sort of comic overtones, as kind of having something a bit more troubling in there, is because it seems to me to most often in production rely upon identity as being something composed of bits and pieces, i.e., costume, as one example, and that is then particularly susceptible to being dismantled, moved about. That where we are most inclined to kind of think of ourselves as having an inner self, to sort of take up the kind of Hamlet view of things, these but the trappings and the suits of woe. In some ways, the Comedy of Errors, its starting premise is kind of saying the trappings and suits are the main thing. That's what we're going to, for this play at least, rely upon to kind of say that person is supposed to be identical to that person. So I, I'm I'm curious for early modern audiences and early modern productions how much there would have been a knowingness
Mm.
that Shakespeare exploits to say, well, look, they're wearing identical costumes. They are supposed to be identical, but I know that they're not. In the same way
Mm.
that disguise in Shakespeare, it's quite rare that people seem to think, hang on, that's Rosalind. That normally the idea that you kind of
Mm.
that convention that you dress up as someone and therefore are that person, seems to be something that he's exploiting in the Comedy of Errors, I think, but I don't know enough about stage practice in the
That's
Globe.
so interesting, isn't it? Because I feel as if this is the point where everybody would quote Ben Jonson. I think Johnson says to Drummond of Forth and all some. I think it's in that account of his opinions. Johnson, if you have Ben Jonson to dinner, he just told you a load of stuff that he thought about John Donne or Queen Elizabeth or various things. And one of the things he thought was he would have liked to have done a play like Plautus, but he couldn't think of getting two actors who were sufficiently similar to make the twin plot remotely plausible. And
Mhm.
that's sometimes used as a way, isn't it, of thinking about Johnson's. It's usually used against Johnson, I think, as a slightly pedantic literalist sort of view of theatre, whereas, we assume Shakespeare's not only happy to do Menachmi, but to double it and to have two sets of actors who look or can be made to um, seem to need to look identical. Yeah, so it's a really interesting question, Jeans, is about whether they were so obviously different that it's in some ways the question is the other way around. How did you persuade people to think that they were the same? Or whether there was a whether it was necessary to make them look make them look different.
Can I jump in on Johnson
Please,
as
yeah.
well? Because
Mm.
I suppose one of the differences with Johnson is that he looks for other points of stability or something. So I'm thinking of The Alchemist, which begins with dumped in the deep end with three characters. All it transpires more or less in or Face certainly is in disguise. We learn right at the end of the play that his name is Jeremy. Um, and the play begins with them all locked in an argument, saying things like "I'll mar all that the tailor has made." That they're basically threatening to rip each other's disguises off.
Mm.
Um, and one of the things that Johnson does that's really interesting that I don't think Shakespeare does do or can do in the way that he works is wait until Act 5 to say to the audience, "Oh, by the way, this character was actually always called Jeremy." Um, so I don't know how to I don't know how to articulate that really, but the point of stability, the point of an identity actually sort of being quite fixed. Shakespeare has to give us something or believes in something quite solid to then be able to move costumes about or do something like that. Whereas Johnson, it seems, can't quite abandon himself to that
Mm.
in the same way.
That's really interesting. Let's have a webinar on Johnson. I'd love to do that. I'm going to just pick up Raphael's point that he's just put in right now, just because I think, and I'm actually going to answer this myself, but because I think it's an interesting question that comes up in different forms quite often in this webinar. So Raphael's answered, this is uh, early-ish in Shakespeare's career. Would we get more out of it by looking at it more pragmatically? Shakespeare's main priority would be to make these plays popular so as to obtain a living. And I think we absolutely would agree with that, Raphael. And I don't think that uh, I think Shakespeare is a brilliantly tuned commercial playwright. the commercial world of the theatre is what generates these plays. It's a wonderful time when the market produces wonderful art. I don't know whether that's still possible or why it was possible then, but it absolutely was. I suppose some of the things we're talking about partly come under a couple of other headings. One is what why do we still care about these plays, or what do they say to us now, which they didn't say to us then? And that more general point, which you'll know, be very familiar with about in some ways the literary work being one that always has a bit more in it than it needed. There's a lovely phrase, I don't know if it's Hazlitt or somebody calls this Shakespeare's supererogation. It was the first time I'd ever come across that word, supererogation. And I take it to mean, I think it means he's always doing more than is needed for the actual task in hand. And we've talked about that a little bit with this language. Um, and we could say, if this is just a funny play about knockabout twins, he goes to a lot of trouble to do it. So it's a really important, interesting question. And I don't think that the point that you make that to say that Shakespeare writes in this way for a commercial audience is definitely part of the answer, but it doesn't always feel like the end of the answer. I'm going to pick up a couple of these questions about women. Would you say that Adriana anticipates characters like Beatrice and Rosalind, which encourage female agency and female speech? Or would you say her more outspoken character is rebuked in the play, like Catherine, especially when considering Amelia's speech towards her? Are women encouraged to be more domineering in their marriages or not? And then Daniel Lloyd, who is on a roll tonight. Daniel, brilliant, thank you. Adriana speaks 2,093 words in Errors, the most out of any character in the play. How does that fit the ideas about the scope for female agency? Do you want to pick up either of those, Ian?
I actually think the production you were talking about, where Adriana and Luciana were doing yoga, and it strikes me that even just the number of lines is a very interesting measure of kind of activity. And one of the things that strikes me with the Comedy of Errors is that an actor could have a lot of fun playing these parts. And when I think of, I don't know, this may be a bad example. I was going to say Desdemona. I wouldn't want to play Desdemona. Maybe that's unfair. I mean, there are fantastic Desdemonas, but the play or Othello certainly is often contriving to make you a kind of sight or an object in some way. Whereas even just thinking, you can join in with the slapstick in the Comedy of Errors, and that does seem important, that you are actually involved in the scenes. The scenes aren't necessarily about you or talking about you, possibly. And examples like Beatrice, for example, are very good ones in that respect as well. That they are the equal of other actors. They get to perform as much. I think that probably is quite important. It's sort of almost aside from the story of the situation of the characters, I think.
That's really interesting. I We've got one question here that I'm going to pick out one particular strand of. There's lots of really interesting strands. Hi, Sean from Singapore. It's good to have you with us. You ask about accidents and circumstance. The plot is heavily reliant on circumstance or accidents, as alluded to by the Duke in the last scene. I'm wondering, how might accidents or circumstance be crucial? Could it be a mirroring of the plot with the themes of loss of agency, shifting identity, so to speak, of the play? And maybe I'll put that with another question, which is also perhaps about shape. Two questions, maybe. One is about anticipating the late romances. How is there more that we would like to say about that? And the other is Mark's question about whether comedy is inherently conservative with order restored in the end. So I suppose they're all about, I've put those together and you could pick out any one of those because they're all about things to do with genre, aren't they? That one of the classic definitions, differences between comedy and tragedy is in Susan Snyder's lovely term that comedy is about evitability rather than inevitability, but that coincidence or something perhaps is a comic device rather than a tragic one.
Mm. I think and again, sort of coming back to your point about Hazlitt and supererogation, that the fact that the play is quite interesting, just opening up kind of extraneous details at particular points. For example, again, sort of actually looking at Aegean's speech, it's phenomenally interesting but odd that there's a storm. They sort of pair off, tie themselves to masts. They come through the storm, and then they hit a big rock, and the ship sinks, and they're lost from each other. Now, why on earth not just have the storm do it? The kind of slight messiness of that I find just very interesting, that Shakespeare sort of seems to want something about that, and I think it sort of fits again with that awkwardness of the end. There's some lines I was just trying to look up where Amelia basically says, "Let's all go inside, talk about what's happened, and just try and work out where have we all been today." Um, and the lines as they are in Folio, she says, "The Duke, my husband, and my children both, and you, the calendars of their nativity, go to a gossip's feast, and joy with me after so long grief, such nativity." Um, and editors have often thought that's weird that she says nativity twice, the calendars of their nativity, after so long grief, such nativity, and they think it must be a misprint. I find it weird that she says, "Everyone go to a feast," rather than "Come, let's all go."
Mm.
Um, so there's, what am I trying to say about that? The messiness of of this feels quite encoded. It doesn't. I think it's Shakespeare sort of wanting these. Let's sort of push it towards a neat formulation, but he
Mm.
wants accidents in there. I think.
Mm. That's brilliant. I think that probably is all the questions that we can manage to take on. Thank you so much for joining in there. So I'm going to ask Ian to do one last thing before we finish, which is to give us a recommendation of something to read or watch or something if people are keen to take Comedy of Errors one step further. So I'll give you a minute to think about that while I warn people about what's coming up through the autumn. So if you want to get ahead of your reading with us, the first Monday in October will be The Merry Wives of Windsor. The first Monday in November will be Henry VIII. And the first Monday in December will be Romeo and Juliet. So Merry Wives of Windsor, Henry VIII, and Romeo and Juliet are what's coming up for us through the autumn. Um, and Ian, do you have a tip for where to go next with Comedy of Errors besides your brilliant introduction, of course?
Oh yes. Do you know what I have? It's more a query, I think. It's a very different play, but recently I have been rereading Measure for Measure, which is a play that people much more frequently say this is a problem play. Is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? And I think what surprised me was that its first recorded performance was at court for King James, and seems to have been part of a double bill with the Comedy of Errors. And they seem very unlikely, odd companion pieces for each other. And maybe that's just a coincidence. Maybe it was just strange that they were put together. But I've been wondering ever since I found that out whether Measure for Measure and Comedy of Errors talk to each other in any interesting way.
Hmm,
So I would encourage people to read Measure for Measure after they've read Comedy of Errors and have a think, because
brilliant.
I don't have any answers about that.
That's a brilliant, unexpected suggestion, but also it makes clear that this is a play that can galvanize relationships with other players, perhaps that because we have been inclined to dismiss it, we sort of wanted to do. That's been wonderful. Jean asks, will we continue after December? Jean, we absolutely will. I'm assuming you are Jean, but if you're Jean, I'm so sorry if I'm mispronouncing. We are 7 plays in, so we've got about 33 to go. So stick with it because we're here for a long, long time. Um, and Hay has asked about emailing with the question that we haven't got to. Yeah, you're absolutely welcome to email me at Oxford, and I'll have a go at answering. Thanks again, everybody. Thank you, Ian. Thanks for being here. See you next time for Merry Wives of Windsor.
Thank
Bye.
you, everyone.